There was a sound that meant something was about to happen on your street, and it had nothing to do with an ice cream van's chime. A voice, rough and carrying, calling out something half song, half shout, echoing off the terraced houses before you ever saw the cart itself. And before you'd even worked out the words, you were already moving, out the front door, down the path, because everyone on the street already knew what that voice meant, and nobody wanted to miss it. The rag and bone man is coming. And here's the thing about him that's almost impossible to explain to anyone under 50 now, however you phrase it. He wasn't selling you anything. He was buying, or trading, more often, for the things your family had already decided were rubbish. Old clothes worn through at the elbow, odd shoes with the sole hanging off, scrap metal, bent pram frames, broken pots and pans, jam jars nobody needed, and yes, bones, actual bones, saved from the Sunday joint and left to dry on a windowsill because somebody, somewhere, wanted them. And in exchange, if you were a child standing at the cartwheel with your mother's old coat bundled in your arms, you might walk away with a balloon on a stick, or a goldfish in a little plastic bag, or, if your mother had sent you specifically to trade for it, a donkey stone to whiten the front step. If the words, any old iron, just did something to you, if you can hear that particular half-song cry in your head right now, carrying down a street that doesn't exist in quite that way anymore, then you remember one of the strangest and most wonderful trades that ever ran through British working-class life. Let's go back to that cart, and that cry, and the horse that knew every street on the round better than the man driving it. Because the story of the rag and bone man and the slow way he disappeared from Britain's streets tells you something about this country that no history book quite captures. Let's start with where he came from, because the rag and bone trade is far older than anyone standing on a 1960s pavement ever realized. The trade goes back at least to Victorian Britain, and in some form long before that, a genuine, functioning economy built entirely on other people's leftovers. Rags weren't rubbish to a Victorian rag merchant. They were raw material. Torn shirts and worn-out trousers went to paper mills, where cotton and linen rags were pulped down into paper, or to textile mills, where they were shredded and rewoven into a cheap, reprocessed cloth called shoddy, the very word we still use today for something badly made, and that's exactly where it comes from. Scrap metal went to foundries and scrap yards to be melted down and reused, and bones, actual animal bones, saved from Sunday dinners across the whole country, went to processors who rendered them down into glue, into fertilizer, and, in the case of the finest bones, into bone china, the very crockery some of those same families might have had, proudly displayed in a cabinet they never used. It was, when you actually sit and think about it, a nationwide recycling system, running door to door, decades before anyone in Britain had ever heard the word recycling, let alone thought of it as something you needed a bin, a leaflet, and a council scheme to do properly. And it's worth understanding what this actually meant for the man doing the collecting, because it wasn't an easy living, whatever nostalgia might suggest looking back. A rag and bone round was, in effect, a small business run entirely on other people's discards, and the margins were thin. He'd buy, or trade small goods for, whatever households handed over, then had to sort it all himself, usually back at a yard or a scrap of waste ground, separating rags by type and quality, metal by kind, bones from everything else, before selling each category on to a different specialist buyer. A rag merchant paid one price for good cotton and a lower price for poor mixed fibers. A scrap dealer weighed metal and paid by weight and type, iron worth little, copper and brass worth considerably more, which is exactly why an old brass doorknob or a length of copper piping could get a far better trade than a whole armful of old clothes. It was physical work too, and relentless. The round walked or ridden every single day, rain or shine, the cart or lorry loaded heavier as the day went on, all of it unloaded and sorted again before he could rest. most rag and bone men weren't getting rich. They were scraping a genuine, hard-earned living out of what everyone else had already decided was worthless. And the man himself, because it was almost always a man, and almost always the same man on the same streets, year after year, until you knew him better than some of your own relatives, was a genuine character of working-class British life. He'd come round on a horse-drawn cart in the earlier years, and later, as the decades wore on, in an old lorry or flatbed truck, though plenty of horses kept working the rounds well into the 1950s, and even later in some towns. And that horse mattered more than you'd think. Rag and bone horses were famous, in their quiet way, for knowing the round better than any map, stopping of their own accord outside houses that regularly traded, moving on without being told at houses that never did, because the horse had walked that street every week for years and had simply learned it, the way you learn your own front path in the dark. In London specifically, the man was just as often called a totter rather than a rag and bone man, and totting was the general word for the whole trade, sorting and dealing in other people's scrap and cast-offs. The word turns up in London slang and street memory for well over a century, and it existed alongside rag and bone man rather than replacing it, so which word you grew up using often came down simply to which part of the country, or even which part of a city you were standing in. And then there was the cry. This is the part that varied street to street, region to region, and nobody who's ever tried to write it down phonetically has ever quite managed to capture it properly, because it wasn't really words by the time it reached your ears. It was a sound, half-sung, rolling and repetitive, carrying for streets in every direction on a quiet morning. Any old iron, any old iron, any old iron was one version, and it became so recognizable it was even turned into a music hall song that outlived the trade itself by decades. In other places, it was simply rag-a-bone, stretched and looped until it barely resembled English at all, and yet every single child on that street knew exactly what it meant and exactly what to do next. And there was the sound of the cart itself, before you even heard the voice, iron-rimmed wheels grinding and clattering over cobblestones, the slow, unhurried clop of hooves keeping a pace that never seemed to change whether the street was empty or full of running children, the occasional creak of the cart's wooden frame under the weight of whatever had already been collected that morning. And underneath all of it, faintly, the yard smell that seemed to travel with him wherever he went, old damp cloth, rust, something faintly organic from the bones, all of it mixing into a smell that, like the smell of warm school milk, you would recognize instantly, even 50 years on, and that you would never once encounter anywhere else in ordinary life. And what you did next depended entirely on what your mother had already decided to get rid of, because the rag and bone man wasn't really trading with children. He was trading with households, and children were simply the ones sent out to do it, clutching a bundle under one arm, delivering exactly what they'd been told to deliver and nothing more. An old coat, too worn for even the youngest child to inherit next, a pair of shoes with the sole flapping loose, a stack of old newspapers tied with string, and in return he'd hand over whatever the going trade was that week, sometimes a few pennies, more often something small and delightful for the child doing the actual delivering, because a happy child was good business, and he knew it. A balloon on a stick was the classic. A small goldfish in a knotted plastic bag, carried home at arm's length the whole way, terrified of dropping it, was the dream trade. And for the mothers themselves, there was the donkey stone, a pale, chalky scouring block, sold or traded by rag and bone men across the industrial north especially, used to scrub and whiten the stone front step and the windowsills, because in streets where you owned very little else, a bright white front step was a matter of real, visible pride, and everybody on the row could see whose step had been done that week and whose hadn't. There was an entire etiquette to it too, one that's almost entirely lost now. Regular customers built up something close to a relationship with their rag and bone man. He'd remember which house always had good scrap, which house never had anything, which household could be relied on to save their bones properly instead of throwing them in with the ash. Some families kept a designated corner of the yard or the coal shed specifically for the rag and bone stuff, building up a stock over weeks between visits, the way you might save up bottles for the milkman's deposit, except this was rubbish being carefully, deliberately hoarded because it was worth something to somebody. And it wasn't only rags, bones, and scrap metal either, though those were the trade's backbone. Old jam jars had value, washed out and stacked by the back door, traded a jar or two at a time for whatever the man was offering that week. Rabbit skins from families who kept rabbits either as pets or, more often in leaner years, for the pot, were worth something too, dried and folded and handed over along with everything else. And there were games that grew up specifically around his visits, small rituals belonging entirely to childhood. Groups of children would run alongside the cart for as long as their legs held out, sometimes simply for the thrill of it rather than any actual trade to make, treating his arrival on the street a bit like a small parade. Some children made a kind of unofficial job out of helping him, holding the horse's bridle for a moment while he made a delivery, or carrying a lighter bundle from a doorstep to the cart, in the hope, usually rewarded, of a penny or a sweet for the trouble. It cost him almost nothing, and it made him, in a small but real way, a genuinely beloved figure on plenty of streets, rather than simply a man collecting other people's rubbish. For the horse itself, in the towns and streets where one was still used right into the 1950s, there was an odd extra layer of street economy sitting quietly underneath the main trade. Children with a bucket and a shovel, waiting for the horse to leave something behind on the cobbles, because manure had real value to anyone growing vegetables on an allotment or in a back garden, and more than one enterprising child made a few extra pennies collecting it before a neighbor got there first. It's also worth remembering that this whole culture of saving scrap for the rag and bone man didn't exist in isolation. It sat inside a much wider British habit of taking metal and materials seriously as a resource, one that had been sharpened hard by the war. During the Second World War, the government ran huge, highly organized scrap collection drives, asking households to hand over iron railings, old pots and pans, and any spare metal they could find, with posters promising it would be melted down to help build Spitfires and tanks. Whether every single saucepan really ended up in an aeroplane is still debated by historians, but the psychological effect on the country was real and lasting. An entire generation raised to believe that nothing metal, nothing usable, should simply be thrown away while the country needed it. When the rag and bone man came round in the years afterward, he wasn't introducing anything strange to that generation. He was simply continuing, in peacetime and for profit rather than patriotism, a habit the war had already deeply embedded. So why did it all fade away? The answer, as with so much of this era, is rising standards of living, alongside the slow arrival of something that eventually made the rag and bone man's whole trade officially redundant: proper, organized rubbish collection. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, more and more households simply had more and threw away more, and the specific, careful economy of saving every scrap of usable rag or bone for a traveling trader began to feel less like sensible thrift and more like an old-fashioned habit nobody quite needed anymore. Councils expanded municipal bin collections. Jumble sales and, later, proper charity shops absorbed a lot of what used to go to the ragman's cart instead, and scrap metal dealers moved toward dealing directly with businesses and industry rather than relying on door-to-door collection from ordinary households. It's worth noting, oddly, that the trade actually had one of its busiest periods during the war itself, when scrap collection was practically a civic duty and rag and bone men found themselves genuinely essential rather than a fading curiosity. It was really the 15 or 20 years after the war, as rationing ended, wages rose, and consumer goods became cheaper and more disposable, than they'd ever been in British history, that the trade began its real, permanent decline, quietly and without anyone quite marking the moment. The horses went first, largely, replaced by lorries as the trade modernized in the towns that kept it going at all, and the trade itself thinned out steadily through the 1960s and 70s, not with one dramatic ending, the way decimalization or school milk had a single named day it stopped, but a slow fade, street by street, town by town, until by the 1980s it had become genuinely rare, surviving mostly in pockets, certain northern industrial towns, certain traveller and Irish traveller communities for whom scrap metal dealing remained, and in some cases still remains today, a real and continuing trade, just far more formalized, with vans and proper scrapyards instead of a horse and a cry down the street. And here's the strange thing about how the rag and bone man survived in British memory, because, in a way, he didn't fade from the culture at all. Even as he genuinely vanished from the streets, he simply moved into fiction. In 1962, the BBC launched Steptoe and Son, a sitcom about a father and son running a rag and bone business from a junk-filled yard in Shepherd's Bush, and it became one of the most beloved and most watched programs in British television history. For an entire generation who grew up after the real trade had already mostly disappeared from their own street, Albert and Harold Steptoe are the rag and bone man, cantankerous, filthy, hilarious, and, underneath it all, strangely tender. Ask anyone under 60 today what a rag and bone man was, and there's a real chance the honest answer is, like in Steptoe and Son, rather than any actual childhood memory of a cart coming down their own road. And that's worth sitting with for a moment, because it means something has genuinely been lost that goes well beyond nostalgia for a balloon or a goldfish. What the rag and bone man actually represented, an entire door-to-door economy built on reuse, on nothing being thrown away while it still had value to somebody, on a household's rubbish becoming another household's raw material, is something Britain has spent the last 20 years trying, in a much clumsier, much more bureaucratic way, to rebuild from scratch. Council recycling bins, separated into their neat color-coded categories, charity shop donation bags, curbside textile recycling collections that a lorry drives past once a fortnight, silent, with no cry down the street, no horse who knows your house, no small human transaction where a child hands over a bundle and gets a goldfish in return. We built the infrastructure back, eventually, because it turned out the rag and bone man had been doing something genuinely necessary all along. What we never quite rebuilt is the relationship, the fact that it used to be a person, on your street, who knew your house, rather than a scheme, a bin, and a leaflet through the door explaining which day is which color. And the trade hasn't entirely vanished even now, which is worth saying honestly, rather than treating this purely as something extinct. In plenty of British towns and cities today, a van still comes round, slower and less frequent than the old horse and cart round ever was, a driver calling out through a loudspeaker rather than his own voice, still asking for scrap metal, old washing machines, unwanted white goods. It's the same trade, doing much the same job, wearing modern clothes. But something in the transaction has thinned out along the way. A recorded announcement playing on a loop is not a voice you'd recognize blindfolded, and a stranger loading a fridge into a van is not a horse that knows your house without being told. There's something else missing now too, and it's smaller, but it matters just as much if you actually lived it. The rag and bone man's visit was an event. A small, ordinary, weekly event, but an event nonetheless. A reason to run outside, a small transaction with a stranger who wasn't really a stranger at all, a tiny negotiation a child could conduct almost entirely on their own. Children today, for entirely understandable reasons, don't hand bundles of old clothes to a man on a cart in exchange for a goldfish. That specific, small independence, the errand, the trade, the walk back up the path proudly carrying whatever you'd got in return, has quietly disappeared along with the trade itself, and it's not really the goldfish anyone misses. It's the errand. So now it's your turn, because I want to hear your rag and bone memories specifically. Do you remember the exact cry from your street? Was it any old iron or something else entirely? And can you still hear it? Did you ever trade something and come away with a balloon? Or were you the lucky one who got the goldfish? Was there a donkey stone in your house? And did your mother ever send you out specially to trade for one? And be honest, when you picture a rag and bone man now, is it a real memory, or is it Albert and Harold Steptoe? Put your memories in the comments below, because this community is where they belong, and every single story adds something the last one didn't. And if this took you right back to that half-sung cry echoing down your street, do something for me. Press the like button, share this with someone who still remembers a horse and cart on their road, and subscribe to Yesterday's Britain, because there is so much more of this Britain waiting to be remembered together. Thank you for watching.